Hello guys, want to make a short little video here talking about ambient occlusion and texture baking. Kind of review some of the other processes that I've started using and kind of put it together all in one video here. I'll try to keep this as short as possible. I'm not going to review everything that's in the other videos, but you can check out the other videos on the channel and get more information on that. But what you're looking at is a building from Bristol Motor Speedway, and this is a photograph that I took in the spring of 2015, shortly after the spring race, obviously in 2015. And it is this building, and that is located in Turn 4. And I believe it's called the Old Smoky Lounge or Turn 4 Lounge or Clubhouse. This is the texture for that building. Obviously there's nothing painted on it. I just have simple colors to differentiate the sides and the faces. What you're looking at is it also has a wireframe. Hopefully that shows up on the video there, but it's also got the cutout for the doors located under this bump out here. You see those sitting down there. I've gone over that process before using the boolean cutting method to cut out the actual size doors, and then exporting the wire map. I've got that in another video as well. Basically that's where you would paint the doors, and even if they don't look right on the texture, they'll be exactly the correct size on the object itself. Just to go over briefly, what I'm covering in this video is how to get a shading layer. Now, if you're familiar with NASCAR 2003 and painting vehicles, you're very familiar with how the templates are configured. You paint your car basically on a template that has a shading layer near the top. If I turn the shading layer on, you can see this is very similar to that. I can paint anything that I want on these base layers, and as long as they're underneath that shading layer, the shading will be applied to whatever I'm painting. This is kind of a new technique for basically us 3D modelers for tracks and things like that. It's definitely a new process for me. I'm just now figuring it out, and I wanted to share what I figured out, and hopefully it helps somebody else as well. You can see that each one of these sides, if I turn the wireframe on, has the upper section, and in this case this is the red side here. There's a very large dark shadow where the inside of this bump out is, and that would be right here. It has a very soft circular shadow around it. The reason you need to do this kind of stuff is because these older games aren't capable of drawing 3D shadows on trackside objects. In this case, it's just not, the processing power was never there, it was never designed to be in it. And even modern games are just now starting to do this kind of thing real time, but definitely NASCAR 2003 cannot. So how do we get this shading layer for a 3D object? Obviously this is before any of the stuff has been painted, you know. It is quote-unquote flatten mapped, where every single face is mapped independently of every single thing else. There's no overlap of any of these faces anywhere on this texture. If you have double mapping, I guess you would call it, where you have multiple faces mapped to an individual part of the texture. Say for a handrail, for instance, if you were doing a handrail around the top of this building, there's a handrail that goes around here that would have transparency, obviously. And more than likely it would have a repetition where the handrail would repeat, most typically horizontally off of the texture. You wouldn't necessarily want shading on that, and you really don't need it, because with the transparency you wouldn't be able to see it. the individual bars end up being so small you're never going to see it. In that case, you may typically have one segment cut out for hand railing that repeats horizontally, and you may just have to go ahead and render that and then just cut that part of the shading layer off so it's not, double, tripled up or quadrupled up in this case with 4 sides, and then you have the inside and outside of that railing as well. So you need to have your object set as an editable poly. You need to have the unwrapping done via the unwrap UVW modifier, and that's located here in the modifier list right there. And I'll open up the UV editor here so you can take a look at that. That bump out, I basically just used the flatten mapping and just rearranged it several times until I was comfortable with it being not overlapping. Alright, so, and I've gone over before how to get the render UVW template to get the wire mesh into your Photoshop template here in another video as well. So let's go over some of the settings in the render to texture window. You can see I went there, rendering and render to texture, or you can simply just hit the 0 key on your horizontal number row at the top of the keyboard. It brings up the same window. What that brings up is a lot of options here. So we need to go over what we're going to set up here. You need to go to render settings, and I'm going to use mental ray daylighting high, and I'm going to load all those presets. And I'm going to scroll down here. You can see the object is selected. Make sure the object is selected. If you click away from it before you open this, then there won't be any of these options available. Make sure you have your object selected so you can work in this window. You'll see that the object name is listed there. The first setting after setting the renderer, we need to talk about padding. What is padding? Let me open the UV editor here and we can talk about that real quick. When it renders the shadow, it's going to render past or pad that edge by 2 pixels in this case. And you can see I have padding set to 2. I tried 4. It ends up overlapping quite a bit. It's a medium-sized texture, so 4 pixels is probably too much. I've already got that set up. If we zoom out a little bit, you can already see I've got a little bit of padding figured into it when I set the edges where they need to be. You can see that down here, more than likely, that's 4 pixels would cause some bleeding into each other a little bit there. So 2 pixels is fine. The next thing that you're not going to worry about the projection mapping. We need to go to mapping coordinates using existing channel. Make sure that's selected. If you've only got one object in your scene, your unwrap UVW, if you go down here to map channel on the right hand side here, it says 1. You're probably only going to have one map channel being used. If you have multiple channels being used, obviously you want to select the correct channel for the unwrap UVW modifier and make sure that matches, but there's only one in this scene, so there's only one available in that list. So I'm going to make sure that's 1. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this because when you open it for the first time, it's not going to have your object added. Right now we need to tell this renderer what we want it to render. So I'm going to click the add button right here, and just in case you missed that, that's directly under that table there. It says add. I'm going to click add. It brings up this box of different things that you can select to be rendered. For this method, I'm going to use the Ambient Occlusion, parentheses MR, and that stands for mental ray. So I'm going to click on the Add Elements button, and you can see it populates the table. And if you notice, the texture defaults to 256 by 256 here. We'll get to that in just a second. We'll go down the list here. What I want to do is click on File Name and Type, and I'll click that box here next to the File Name and Type window here. And it brings up a new one where I can change what kind of file format. And let me delete the other one real quick. I'd already tried it in here, but we'll go ahead and set that for .png. And we'll click Save. We'll do RGB 24-bit, 16.7 million colors, alpha channel, and interlaced. And we'll make sure it says target map slot diffuse color. We'll make sure our element background color is true white, which is 255 for all three colors there. And we're going to change the map size to 1024 by 1024. You can click on these quick preset buttons over here, or you can manually enter what your texture size is. Keep on scrolling down here. Next thing you'll see is the selected element and unique settings. If you're familiar with mental ray rendering, some of this stuff should be pretty familiar to you. Samples is basically the resolution of the shadows. For this, I'm going to leave it at 16. Typically, you're going to be working around 128 to 256. For the one that I did previously, it was 512, and it took about 20 minutes for my machine to render that. So obviously, the higher the number, the more complex the shadows are going to be, and the better it's going to look, but the longer it's going to take. Now, working on an older game like NASCAR 2003, setting that for 1024, let's say, you're probably going to lose a lot of that information when you convert it to a MIP file anyways, which typically adds compression to it. So there's really no need. 256 would be the absolute maximum. 128 is typically plenty fine. If the texture is going to be very large to begin with and then shrunk down later, you might want to go with the higher number like a 256 or 512, and then you're going to lose some of that obviously when you shrink the texture down. But for this example, 16 is fine. 16 doesn't look terrible, to be honest with you. For NASCAR 2003, it's not horrible at all. For a modern game, that might not be enough. Obviously you want your bright to be white and your dark to be black. You can mess around with that if you're setting your environment in some other colored environment. Typically you wouldn't have that in a NASCAR racetrack, but you can play around with that and see what different results you can get. Save source, you want to make sure that that's selected. Save source, create shell. Make sure you have a selection box there. Duplicate source to baked, make sure that's selected as well. And because we want this to output a PNG file that we can apply to our texture as a layer, it's easier to paint the full texture that way, instead of painting this wall and then trying to copy that part of the shading over to this one and then trying to copy it over to this, and then this one's different. So it's easier to do it exactly the way you would in a car file or car template by just having a shading layer on top of everything else that you're painting with no shading. So you want to render to file only instead of rendering it to the original texture or to another material map slot in Max, because if you're just doing it for renders, obviously that's completely different than what we're doing here. So you want to make sure you check render to files only and keep source materials. And I'm going to click the render button. Now while this is going on, I'm going to keep talking, and I'm not actually going to let this completely render out, but I'll go ahead and click render here. And it brings up two new windows, and what you'll see is a mental ray render to texture process window, and then the output window over here. Now, I don't fully understand why, but on my computer it displays a black screen and you don't see anything. Now, it's not going to show anything even if you do click this button up here next to the RGB color, switch it to black and white. It still doesn't show anything while it's doing the computing final gather points. Once this gets to 100% and switches over to the actual drawing of the shading, you'll see some of the progress here, and I'll wait for that to start so I can show you the process here. But if I uncheck that and only do RGB display in this window, all you see is this vague outline. It's hard to tell what's done and what's not, so if your computer's a little bit slow, you know, checking that box up there for the black and white might give you a better visual indication of, you know, the process and how long it's going to take and how much is actually done. Having said that, it doesn't actually display the shading in this window. It's actually going to save that file on your desktop or wherever you chose to save that in that window right here, which is under name and file type. I'm going to go ahead and cancel that, and it's going to get angry for me canceling it, but what it will do is it will spit out a file. Actually, this is the one I canceled, but when it's done it will spit out a file that looks like this right here. And what you do is you open that in Photoshop. I'll go ahead and open it, and it'll look like very similar to this. What you want to do is you want to hit Control A to select all, Control C to copy all, and then go over to your texture, and you want to do Edit, Paste Special, Paste in Place. So you can see it pasted that shading layer as a white background with the shading on top of it. So what you would want to do is open the layer styles or double click on the layer in Photoshop. Just change that to a multiply, and in this example I'll just use 80%. Move this out of the way. Move that slider to wherever you think the shading looks good. In this case, just for visual clarity, I used 80%. So hopefully that shows you how you can get realistic shading fairly quickly, and, you know, apply the same logic that you would apply to painting a car, to painting your objects and trackside objects, buildings, whatever. And that gives you a very good result. So I will post a link to the ambient occlusion settings. I took a screenshot of those settings. I'll post that in the description below. And I'll post a link to another video where I got most of this information from. And I believe that is all I need to cover in this video. So I hope you have a good day. Thanks for watching.